Hello, and welcome to another episode of Economist Weekly. This week we'll be talking about Karl Marx and his influence on the political and economic spheres of the world. First off, we have Nick Gulley, who's going to present to us on G.F.W. Hegel and his influence on the earlier years of Karl Marx.
Now, it's important to understand Marx's philosophy and how that affects his views on economics. The greatest influencer of Marx is G.F.W. Hegel, whom he became acquainted with in his time at the University of Berlin in the early 1830s. Now, Hegel had two very big ideas that influenced Marx: this inevitable progression of history and this dialectical method of learning. Hegel believed that history was moving forward toward a definite end, and the end being the absolute idea. And the way we get there is from ideas becoming theses, which naturally collide with their antithesis, which synthesize into a new thesis, and so on and so forth. Now, where Marx departs from Hegel is that he believed that history was stuck at the moment in this economic spiral of perpetrated by class struggle. And the end of history wasn't an absolute idea, it was the end of this class struggle. And that wasn't somewhere way off in the future, it actually could happen right now. All that needs to happen is the proletariat overthrow of the bourgeoisie. And but Hegel, in this case, was able to provide Marx with the vocabulary and the skeleton for what would become his philosophy and later his economic thought.
Thank you for that, Mr. Gulley. Next up, we have Karl Trivanovich. But before we get there, let's start with our joke of the week. Our joke of the week this week is, why did God create economists? Do you want to know? Well, let's wait until after we hear from Karl Trivanovich on how Karl Marx influenced Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin.
So I'm going to be talking about the materialist aspect of Marx's philosophy, this kind of political and economic Gnosticism, the idea that the material is the primary metric by which you measure progress. Marx talked about this in his various writings, and they eventually made their way to Lenin when he started reading Marx's writings in his young adult years. In Robert Service's biography of Lenin, he writes the following: "All the while, he was conforming his intuition that Russia's future lay with industry, urbanization, and large-scale social organization. Moral questions, for him, were an irrelevance. From Marx, he had already taken a philosophy of history, which stressed that the conventional ideas in society were always framed by the ruling classes in their own interest. Morality was consequently a derivative of class struggle." This idea manifested itself in later communist regimes. First, the one Lenin is most closely associated with, the Soviet Union. Stalin's policy of industrialization was all about showing that the Soviet Union could compete with the West in creating material prosperity. In the biography of Stalin written by Robert Conquest, he records that Stalin himself wrote, "We hope to realize collectivization with reference to the peasants, little, by means of orderly economic, financial, cultural, and political measures." He continues later, "Collectivization will be complete when all peasants have been transformed on a new technical basis of electrification and mechanization, when the majority of working peasants have been organized in cooperatives, and the majority of villages contain agricultural associations of a collective character." Of course, there were consequences to this. The Soviet Union is known for being a totalitarian state with gulags and famines. Later, communist China was not that much different, with its own attempt at industrialization with the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s and early 60s. Logistically, it worked a bit different than the Soviet Union. People were forced to work in the communes, and they had to deal with work quotas, etc., etc. Of course, the problem was that working conditions were very harsh, and punishments for breaking the smallest of rules were very draconian. One story tells of a boy who stole a potato, and as punishment, his father was forced to bury him on the spot. The story goes that the father seemingly died of grief 3 weeks later. Now contrast these developments with Western liberal democracies, which took into account, besides the material, the ideational components, the human needs for freedom and civil liberties. Marxist regimes attempted to develop without taking that into account, focusing only on the material. And we see the consequences of that from Lenin onward.
Thank you for that, Kyle. And so have you thought about why God made economists? Well, God made economists to make weather forecasters look good. So let's hear from our next participant, Joseph Holmes, and he is talking about the labor theory of value.
Karl Marx's philosophy and economics make a lot more sense when you realize that he adheres to the economic labor theory of value, which is what most everyone believed in prior to the Marxist Revolution, where we decided that that's the value of a product or service was whatever the buyer was willing to pay for it. People believed that the value or price of a product or service was determined by how much work it took for the seller to make it. Karl Marx logically applied that if this is true, then the laborers, the ones that give the product or service value, should be the ones who get the benefits, the money for that. This is why every Marxist regime that has tried to apply Marxist thought has tried to redistribute wealth. Especially a good example, North Vietnam, 1954, 1956, where they instituted, land redistribution or land reform. This is, just stealing people's land and distributing it to the peasants. Another really interesting part of the Marxist labor theory of value is when it applies to his materialism. Because if everything that's his value has value because of what work is put into it, and if human beings are simply material beings, then our value is determined by how much work was put into us, how much food it took, how much shelter it took to keep us alive. And that's why believing that was the value of human beings is why the Soviet Union, gave food but burned the churches. And the test of really any kind of ideology or philosophy or system is when it's applied, if it works, especially long term. And I think we can see that because in the 70s and 80s, every Marxist regime had to do reforms or collapse because it gave food and gave shelter, but it didn't allow for human freedoms and human religions. We can see that they were missing something about human beings, and the labor theory of what makes value, combined especially with materialism, really did not turn out to be true or work long term.
Thank you for speaking to us today, Nick Gulley, Karl Trivanovich, and Joseph Holmes. Next week on Economist Weekly, we'll be having a special guest lecture from Dr. Paul Mueller on Adam Smith. Stay tuned, and I hope you have a great week.